A young couple thought they had found the perfect nanny for their little girl. She smiled sweetly, spoke gently, and seemed like a blessing. But behind closed doors, when no one was watching, something dark was happening. The parents had no idea, until the day they placed a hidden camera in their home. What they discovered left them in shock. Jane, a woman of striking beauty and determination, had moved to Lagos from Benin City after her marriage to Peter. Her sharp business sense and ambition made her stand out in the male-dominated world of import and export. Jane dealt in fabrics and accessories, and her business had grown rapidly. She was known for flying out of the country often, chasing deals in Dubai, China, and Turkey, returning with goods that kept her customers loyal. Her husband, Peter, was no less ambitious. A tall, calm man in his mid-30s, Peter was the branch manager of a reputable bank in Victoria Island. Every morning he left the house in well-ironed suits, his tie perfectly knotted, his shoes polished to a shine. To his staff, he was a professional, fair but firm. To the corporate clients he managed, he was dependable. But beneath the surface, Peter was a man torn between duty and family. Their home in Lekki was comfortable and modern, a two-story duplex with neatly trimmed hedges and a gate that opened automatically. Inside, the furniture gleamed with polish, the air-conditioned rooms always cool against the Lagos heat. To neighbors and friends, Jane and Peter were the picture of success. But success, like the Lagos sun, cast long shadows. The first cracks appeared after the birth of their daughter, Laura. She had arrived on a humid Wednesday night, her cries filling the delivery room at Lagoon Hospital. Jane had looked at the tiny bundle in her arms and felt a surge of emotions she could barely explain. Peter had stood by, his eyes moist, whispering, "She's beautiful. She's ours." In the days that followed, Peter became even more convinced that Jane needed to slow down. One evening, when Laura was barely 3 weeks old, he approached her in the living room. "Jane," he began, his tone soft but serious, "I've been thinking. Now that Laura is here, maybe you should take a step back from all the traveling. At least for a while. She needs her mother." Jane looked up from the laptop on her lap, her brows furrowing. "Peter, you know how hard I've worked to build this business. I can't just abandon everything because of one child." "One child," Peter repeated, hurt flickering in his eyes. "She's not just one child, Jane. She's our daughter. She needs your time, your love. We can manage with what I earn. I can take care of us." Jane sighed, shutting her laptop with a snap. "You don't understand. If I stop now, I'll lose everything. Customers will turn to other suppliers. The market doesn't wait for anyone, not even for mothers. I promise I'll hire the best help. Laura will be fine." Peter fell silent, frustration bubbling in his chest. He loved his wife, admired her drive, but he also feared what her absence could mean for their child. And so, the decision was made. A nanny was brought in to take care of Laura while Jane traveled and Peter worked. Life settled into a routine. Jane's days were filled with flights, shipments, and business calls. Peter's days were filled with bank reports, client meetings, and late nights at the office. Laura's days were left in the hands of the nanny. At first, Peter tried to raise the subject again. "Jane, I don't like this arrangement," he said one Sunday morning as they prepared for church. "Laura is closer to the nanny than to us. She reaches out for her, not for you." Jane applied lipstick in front of the mirror, her expression calm. "It's temporary. Once she grows older, she'll understand. Besides, what matters is that she's well cared for. Isn't that what's important?" Peter wanted to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. He didn't want to fight. He told himself it was just a phase, that children were resilient, that love could always be rekindled. But deep inside, he knew that shadows were gathering, and something precious was slipping through their fingers. By night, when the city finally quieted, Peter often lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily. Beside him, Jane slept peacefully, her phone charging on the bedside table, ready for the next day's business calls. He thought of Laura's tiny hands, her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when he tossed her in the air. He feared that if they weren't careful, those sparkles would dim, replaced by something he dared not name. And so the story began, not with villains in the shadows, but with two good people caught in the whirlwind of ambition and the restless spirit of Lagos. The morning after Laura was born, the world seemed different for Peter. The drive home from the hospital was no longer just a routine Lagos commute. The traffic jams, the impatient Danfo drivers swerving dangerously, even the hawkers knocking at his car window with chilled bottles of water. Everything seemed strangely insignificant. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about loan reports or meetings. He was thinking about a tiny baby girl who had gripped his finger as if she never wanted to let go. At the hospital, Jane had looked radiant despite her exhaustion. She had cradled Laura with a smile that melted Peter's heart. "She's going to be strong," Jane had whispered, "just like her mother." Peter had chuckled, brushing his daughter's cheek with his thumb. "And stubborn too if she takes after you." Those first weeks were filled with sleepless nights, but Peter didn't mind. He would often rock Laura in his arms while Jane dozed. Sometimes, when the baby's cries pierced the night, Peter would rise before Jane even stirred. To him, fatherhood was not a burden, but a miracle. But Jane saw things differently. While she loved her daughter, she also felt chained by the endless needs of a newborn. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from clients. Fabric shipments awaited her attention. Deadlines for payments loomed. She tried to manage both worlds, the baby and the business, but her patience wore thin. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Laura asleep in her crib, Jane spoke her mind. "Peter, I can't continue like this. My business is suffering. Orders are delayed, and my competitors are already taking advantage." Peter, holding a newspaper, lowered it slowly. "Jane, we agreed. At least take some months to focus on Laura. She's just a baby. This is when she needs you most." Jane shook her head. "I can't. You don't understand the kind of market I run. 1 week of delay can cost me clients. Months? I can't afford that." Peter leaned forward, his voice tense. "And what about Laura? Can you afford to lose her trust, her bond? Money can be recovered, time with a child cannot." Silence hung between them. Jane turned her face away, her jaw tightening. She knew Peter was right in a way, but she also knew that if she stopped, everything she had worked for would collapse. The following week, Jane began looking for a nanny. She interviewed several women in their late 20s and early 30s, each promising loyalty and care. Some came recommended by agencies, others by neighbors. Jane was meticulous, asking about their previous employers, their habits, even their health. Finally, she settled on a young woman named Blessing. Blessing was polite, soft-spoken, and appeared trustworthy. She dressed modestly, spoke fluent English, and claimed to have worked with 2 families before. "I love children, Ma," Blessing said during the interview, her hands neatly folded in her lap. "They are like angels. I treat them as if they were mine." Jane smiled, relieved. "That's good to hear. My daughter is my treasure. I travel a lot, so I need someone who will care for her as I would." Peter was less enthusiastic. "Do you have references?" he asked firmly. "Yes, sir," Blessing replied, handing him 2 phone numbers written in neat handwriting. Peter pocketed the note, but wasn't fully convinced. Still, he said nothing more. A week later, Blessing moved in. She settled quickly into the household routine, waking early to prepare Laura's bath, dressing her neatly and feeding her patiently. She sang lullabies in a sweet voice and kept the house tidy. Jane was impressed. "See?" she told Peter one evening, smiling as she packed her suitcase for a trip. "I told you we'd find the right person. Blessing is wonderful." Peter grunted. "We'll see." For the next few months, everything seemed smooth. Blessing took Laura to school when she started nursery, waited at the gate for her, and even helped her with homework. Neighbors would sometimes comment, "Your nanny is so dedicated, God bless her." Jane would beam with pride, while Peter merely nodded politely. But Peter noticed things Jane overlooked. He saw how Laura clung more to Blessing than to her mother. He saw the way his daughter's eyes followed the nanny out of a room while barely reacting to Jane's return from a trip. One night, he voiced his worry. "Jane, don't you see what's happening? Laura is more attached to Blessing than to us." Jane, tired from a flight, waved him off. "Peter, stop exaggerating. Children are like that. They bond with whoever spends the most time with them. It doesn't mean she doesn't love us." Peter frowned. "And doesn't that bother you? That your daughter feels more comfortable with someone else?" Jane sighed, massaging her temples. "Peter, please. I've had a long day. Let's not argue tonight." Peter fell silent, but his heart was heavy. Laura, meanwhile, grew into a bright little girl. At 3, she was curious, talkative, and full of laughter. She loved playing with dolls, singing songs she learned at school, and asking endless questions about the world. "Mummy, why is the sky blue?" she once asked Jane, tugging at her blouse. Jane smiled distractedly, scrolling through her phone. "Because God made it that way, darling." Laura tilted her head. "But why didn't he make it green?" Jane chuckled faintly. "Go and ask your daddy that one." It was Peter who often indulged Laura's questions, telling her stories from his childhood in Delta State or explaining how rain came from the clouds. Their bond grew naturally, though Peter's time was also limited, but slowly beneath the surface of their household, an unease was brewing. Blessing, who once seemed gentle, began showing flashes of impatience when no one was looking. At first it was subtle. An irritated sigh when Laura spilled juice, a rough tug on her arm when she lingered at the door. Laura, too young to explain, began to change in ways her parents didn't immediately notice. Her laughter became less frequent. She started drawing sad faces with crayons instead of flowers and suns. At night, she sometimes woke up crying softly, though when Jane or Peter asked what was wrong, she only shook her head. The shadows were lengthening in their home, but neither parent saw clearly enough to understand. Blessing had blended into the household so seamlessly that at first no one suspected anything. She was polite when Jane was around, always quick to say yes, ma, or no, sir, to Peter. She moved about the house quietly, her slippers barely making a sound on the tiled floor. To visitors, she was a picture of loyalty and discipline, but behind closed doors, a different side of her began to surface. It started with impatience. One afternoon, Laura accidentally knocked over her cup of pap during breakfast. The hot porridge spilled across the table, dripping onto the floor. Blessing's eyes flashed. "Look at you," she snapped, grabbing Laura's small hand. "Always scattering things. Can't you sit properly?" Laura whimpered. I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't clean the mess," Blessing muttered harshly. She yanked the child off her chair and shoved a rag into her hands. "Wipe it up." Laura bent down, tears stinging her eyes as she tried to wipe the floor with her tiny hands. From then on, Blessing's temper showed itself more often. When Laura played too loudly, she hissed. When Laura asked too many questions, she barked at her to keep quiet. Sometimes, when the girl was slow to finish her food, Blessing would snatch the plate away and dump it in the sink. At first, Laura thought it was normal. She was too little to understand. But as the days went by, fear crept into her eyes whenever Blessing entered the room. When Jane was home, Blessing transformed. She became sweet and gentle, laughing at Laura's jokes, combing her hair tenderly, and singing nursery rhymes. Jane, already convinced she had made the right choice, saw nothing wrong. "Blessing is such a blessing indeed," she once told Peter, smiling. But Peter wasn't so sure. He had noticed Laura's reluctance to speak when Blessing was around. He noticed how she stiffened if the nanny touched her shoulder. One evening after dinner, he asked Laura quietly, "My princess, are you happy with Auntie Blessing?" Laura hesitated, her little fingers twisting the hem of her dress. She shouts at me sometimes." Peter frowned. "Shouts at you? Why?" Laura's eyes darted nervously to the kitchen where Blessing was washing plates. Because I'm slow." Peter's heart clenched, but before he could press further, Jane called out from the living room, "Peter, please help me check this invoice." By the time he looked back at Laura, she had gone silent again, her face clouded with fear. The changes in Laura were small at first, but undeniable. She stopped singing in the mornings. Once she would hum cheerful tunes while brushing her teeth or dressing for school. Now, silence hung around her like a shadow. Her drawings changed too. Instead of bright suns and flowers, she drew houses with no windows, stick figures with frowns, or scribbles in dark colors. At night, she sometimes had nightmares. She would wake up crying, clutching her teddy bear tightly. "Laura, what's wrong?" Jane would ask, rushing into the room, but Laura would only shake her head, whispering, "Nothing, Mummy. I'm fine." Jane brushed it off as a phase. "Children are like that," she told Peter when he raised the issue. "Maybe she's just adjusting to school." Peter wasn't convinced. "Jane, she's not herself anymore. Can't you see it? She hardly smiles. She looks scared half the time." Jane sighed, tired from another long day of business calls. "Peter, please, you always think too much. Laura is fine. You worry too much." But in his heart, Peter knew something was wrong. One Saturday morning, Peter decided to test his suspicion. He stayed home instead of going to the bank. From his study, he quietly watched how Blessing interacted with Laura. At first, all seemed normal. Blessing helped her brush her teeth, dressed her neatly, and prepared breakfast. But then, when Laura accidentally dropped a spoon on the floor, Blessing's face hardened. "Clumsy girl," she hissed. She grabbed Laura by the arm, shaking her slightly. "Can't you hold something properly?" Laura's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Auntie." Peter's fists clenched. He was about to storm out when Jane called from upstairs. "Peter, please help me with my luggage." By the time he returned to the kitchen, Blessing had transformed again, smiling as if nothing had happened. "Sir, do you want more tea?" she asked sweetly. Peter forced a smile, but his mind was racing. That night, after Laura had gone to bed, he confronted Jane again. "Jane, I saw it with my own eyes today." Blessing scolds her harshly when we're not around. She grabbed her roughly. "Jane, this woman is not who you think she is." Jane frowned. "Peter, are you sure? Maybe you misunderstood. You know children can be clumsy. Sometimes nannies get frustrated." Peter slammed his hand lightly on the table. "That's exactly the problem. She should never take out her frustration on a child. Jane, open your eyes before it's too late." Jane looked away, conflicted. For the first time, a seed of doubt entered her heart. The breaking point came one rainy afternoon. The sky over Lagos was heavy with clouds, rain pouring down in torrents that beat against rooftops and flooded the streets. Peter was at the bank, buried in paperwork. Jane had just returned from a business trip, exhausted but relieved to be home. As she entered the living room, she noticed Laura sitting quietly on the couch, her teddy bear clutched tightly. "Laura, my baby!" Jane exclaimed, rushing to hug her. "I missed you so much." But Laura didn't leap into her arms as expected. She hugged her teddy tighter, her eyes distant. Jane frowned. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Laura shook her head. "Nothing, Mummy." But Jane's motherly instinct stirred uneasily. She had ignored Peter's warnings for too long, but now, looking at her daughter's sad face, she felt something was deeply wrong. Laura's laughter, once like the chiming of church bells on a Sunday morning, had grown faint. She no longer ran to the door to greet Jane when she returned from her business trips. Instead, she would sit quietly in a corner, clutching her favorite teddy, staring at the ground as if afraid of something unseen. Jane noticed, but each time she tried to ask, Laura would shake her head. "Mummy, I'm fine," she would whisper, eyes darting nervously towards the kitchen where the nanny busied herself. At first, Jane thought her daughter was just tired from school, but as the weeks stretched, the change became impossible to ignore. Laura no longer ate with appetite, no longer sang along to the songs on the television, and sometimes woke up screaming in the night. One evening, Peter raised the matter. "Jane," he said as they sat at the dining table, the glow of the overhead bulb casting long shadows across the plates. "Have you noticed Laura? She's not the same child we knew. Something is wrong." Jane sighed heavily, placing her fork down. "I've seen it too. But what can we do? I've asked her over and over. She doesn't want to talk." Peter leaned forward. "Maybe we need to watch more closely. I don't like the way the nanny looks at her sometimes. It's cold." Jane frowned. She wanted to defend the nanny. After all, she had hired her. But in truth, even she had begun to feel an unease she couldn't explain. Days turned into weeks. Laura's decline became alarming. Her teachers reported she was withdrawn in class, hardly participating. When Jane asked her directly one evening, Laura only muttered, "I don't like Auntie." Jane's heart skipped. "Which auntie? The nanny?" Laura only nodded but refused to say more. That night Jane tossed and turned. Guilt pricked her like needles. Peter had asked her to stay home years ago, and she had refused. Now their daughter was suffering. "Maybe we need proof," Peter said one morning as he tied his tie for work. "If it's really the nanny, we must know." Jane bit her lip. "You mean install a camera?" "Yes, it's the only way." The following weekend, when the nanny had gone to buy groceries, Peter and Jane fixed a small CCTV camera in the living room, another in the corridor, and one discreetly near Laura's bedroom. They said nothing, waiting patiently to see what the lenses would capture. The first day, nothing unusual happened. The nanny acted normal, feeding Laura, helping her with homework. Jane almost felt guilty for doubting her. But on the second evening, when Jane checked the recordings alone in her bedroom, her blood froze. On the screen, the nanny's face hardened the moment Jane and Peter left the house. Her voice turned sharp, her hands harsh. "Sit down, you stubborn child," she barked. Laura whimpered, clutching her teddy. Jane's hands trembled as she fast-forwarded. The scenes grew worse, yelling, threats, unnecessary punishments. "God!" Jane whispered, covering her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes as she paused the video. She could not bear to watch further. When Peter returned, she showed him, his jaw clenched, fists tight. "This is evil," he muttered. "We must act now." The next day, Jane left for work as usual, but inside she was restless. She could hardly concentrate in her shop at Balogun Market. By midday, her phone buzzed, a motion alert from the CCTV. She opened the app, and what she saw made her knees weaken. Laura was crying. The nanny loomed over her, scolding harshly. Jane dropped everything. "Peter, come home! Now!" By the time she reached the house, Peter was already there. Together, they confronted the nanny. "What is the meaning of this?" Jane shouted, her voice shaking. The nanny froze, eyes wide. "Madam, I don't understand." Peter slammed his hand on the table. "Don't lie. We have it all on camera." The nanny's face fell. She stuttered, then began to beg. "Please, sir, madam, forgive me. It was just—" "Enough!" Jane screamed, tears streaming down her face. "You will never touch my daughter again!" Peter called the authorities. Within an hour, the nanny was taken away. Laura clung tightly to Jane's leg, trembling. Jane bent down, hugging her fiercely. "Mummy's here. I'm so sorry, my baby. I should have been here for you." The neighborhood buzzed with the news. Neighbors shook their heads in disbelief. "Hey, in this Lagos, one must be careful," one woman said. "Not every nanny is trustworthy." The police assured Peter and Jane that justice would be served. For the first time in months, the house felt lighter, though Laura remained shaken. That night, Jane could not sleep. She sat by Laura's bed, watching her daughter breathe softly. She whispered a prayer, vowing never to let her child suffer again. It took weeks for Laura to begin smiling again. Jane canceled several business trips and worked more from home. She learned how to braid Laura's hair, helped her with homework, and read bedtime stories every night. "Mummy, will you travel again?" Laura asked one evening, her eyes wide with fear. Jane kissed her forehead. "Not unless I have to. You come first now." Peter, too, made changes. He adjusted his schedule at the bank, ensuring he was home earlier. The family began to eat dinner together, laughing again, rebuilding what had been lost. Slowly, the shadows lifted from Laura's eyes. She started humming again, her teddy once more a symbol of comfort instead of fear. Months later, Jane sat in church one Sunday, Laura on her lap, Peter by her side. The sermon was on family and priorities. Jane felt every word pierce her heart. After service, she turned to Peter. "You were right from the start. No success is worth losing our child." Peter smiled faintly. "We've learned. That's what matters now." Jane held Laura close. "From today, I will not just be a mother in name, but in presence. Our children need us more than the world does. Laura giggled, wrapping her little arms around both parents. For the first time in a long while, the family felt whole. The lesson was clear. Wealth and success could never replace love, care, and presence in the life of a child.